That scream you're hearing in this one moment from Venom, that's not Tom Hardy. That's Scott Whyte. Scream artists are some of Hollywood's best-kept secrets. Like, actually secret. Take Ashley Peldon. She's one of the most accomplished screamers in Hollywood. But you might not know where to find her, as productions don't always want audiences to know that their stars have been dubbed. This makes nailing both the emotion and the actor's voice that much more important. Here's how they get the perfect...
I'm sure I blasted you guys.
A lot of the sounds captured on set aren't actually usable, so they have to be re-recorded later.
The great background actors who are there on set that day who probably weren't mic'd, or maybe there was too much going on in the noise. They'll have wind machines going and sound effects, or you'll have like the stuntman or the director yelling at the actors.
But when it comes to screams, sound quality is just one factor. Screams are physically difficult. Just look at this clip of Hugh Jackman dubbing some of his noises from Logan. So if an actor wants to keep their voice intact, these skilled recording artists can help.
You know, maybe I'm more expendable, because for a session fee, I can blow out my voice.
Peldon and Whyte first need to know what type of scream they're doing, as that will impact their performance. One of the most common screams you'll see in movies are fearful ones, but they're not actually realistic.
Now what's interesting is in real life, most people will probably freeze up and not a lot of sound comes out, but it's not as dramatic on screen, so we want to make sure that it's a big, loud, terrifying scream.
Determining where in the body fear comes from can make the scream more believable. Peldon says fear screams should feel involuntary, even if they aren't, so she puts her diaphragm to work.
You want it as messy as possible to get it the most realistic. So like if you hear just a really clean, short, or contained kind of scream, it's not really as realistic for somebody who's in a lot of fear. But if somebody is fearing for their life or in a really terrifying situation, it's got the adrenaline pumping, it's got the sweat, it's got the movement, so it's going to be more of a kind of a feel scream.
You can see and hear this as Peldon watches an old horror clip.
Where it's the building tension is what's important there. This one, to me, would feel more of a fear building kind of scream rather than a blood-curdling scream.
But what makes that scream sound different from this one?
Rage is the emotion of anger, right? So it's screaming with the intention of pent-up emotions. You need to let it out.
Screams that come from a place of anger call for a clenched mouth and tighter body position. And a more empowering rage scream calls for Peldon to fully open her mouth. Whyte will do the same when recording war cries for games like Call of Duty. For other roles, Peldon will channel grief.
So grief has a different feel because this is pure pain, but not physical pain, right? This is just emotional pain. I tend to think of this as the most uncontained and unhinged kind of feeling.
When syncing to a clip, she'll often need to give multiple options.
This is a no, she's saying.
Listen as she tries one scream with the word no. And one without. Convincing screams involve much more than just incorporating dialogue. Listen to all the extra pants and breaths Whyte adds to his screams during a fight scene from the video game Days Gone. These wordless physical reactions are called efforts, and they're crucial to fight screams.
It's different than when it's a scream of fear that's more of a pull-in sensation. Usually these are more of a push-out kind of sensation. There's an impact attached.
Each breath and grunt will have subtle differences based on the type of distress their characters experience.
A gut shot would knock the wind out of you, which is more of a face punch would be more of a quick strike, like
While this effort fits in perfectly when Whyte's character delivers a kick, this one matches when he swings a machete. All these variations help keep the scene alive.
all of the energy when the camera's not on my character to keep that character going in the background.
But some screams don't fit neatly into one category. For example, in Incredibles 2, Whyte had to create the scream for a pilot who's thrown out of a helicopter.
The fear of being pushed out of the helicopter, which then turns into anger, like, I shouldn't have been kicked out of that plane, or whatever. So it couldn't just be a fierce, and then you hit the water. It had to have a little two-part act. And once you hit water, you're not going to hear any more of the, you don't hear the arc of the voice. It's just,
This process gets even trickier when scream artists dub for a high-profile actor, like Whyte did for Tom Hardy during the motorcycle chase in Venom. Whyte first needed to study the actor's voice to figure out what makes it unique.
No, you are out of your mind! So Tom Hardy has sort of a gruff, with sort of a lower sort of a voice thing. So I knew going in that it had to have a little more grit to the voice.
Next, he did what's called chasing the scene, where he watches the sequence from start to finish, adding all screams and efforts as the scene progresses.
Cut 2. Now this is when you breathe and don't pass out. Feeling a little lightheaded, but you push through. Back to it. And you can tell it's a workout. One short few minute scene in and I'm already sweating bullets.
After that breather, Whyte looked for specifics.
We're really trying to hone in on the actual scream itself and analyze the scream.
Like when an explosion goes off behind Hardy.
He's got his closed mouth and his teeth are showing. And so you have to yell through your teeth to match that performance.
Then, when Hardy flies off his motorcycle, Whyte had to sustain a scream for nearly 10 seconds without losing the imitation of Hardy's voice.
The art of a long scream is to kind of tighten your vocal folds just enough and release just enough air that you can prolong that scream as long as people need. When you do that, you're kind of tightening your stomach while, again, Tom Hardy's voice is more grittier, lower. So you kind of have to get that gravelly thing in your scream while you're pinching your vocal folds and tightening your diaphragm just to get out enough air. Because if you're pushing too much air, you're going to run out of air.
All of these screams, whether they're fear, rage, or fighting sounds, won't carry the same emotional punch until they've gone through a layering process. Those layers can include the actor's real vocals mixed with the dubbed vocals and digital sounds. Layering is especially helpful for non-human voices, like when Whyte performed the otherworldly screams of the demon from The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Here's a demonstration of how a sound mixer might take Whyte's raw screams and add effects to make them more powerful. Listen to these three elements combined in a scene. Creepy, right? Well, adding effects like reverb to create an echo and a rumble can make them even scarier.
Using what the human body can do and then taking effects, putting it all in the melting pot.
These clips don't seem as exciting, frightening, or sad until a scream artist's work is added to it. So what makes one of Peldon's real screams sound better than this one?
I think what makes the difference between what sounds kind of like a generic scream that they could just get from their library of screams versus one that really fits the scene is matching what we're seeing. The actor, the energy, the emotion. My scream isn't just noise, it's an acting burst.
6 screams, 2 seconds each, go. Give us options. And you're like, ah! 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 And then they'll grab each of those files and use them all in different places of the game. So.